Hello and welcome to the DeakHeads podcast. My name is Rob Delves, and as always, I'm joined by Sean Jessamine and Damon Bednarski. Firstly, hello to you, Sean. How are you, mate?
I'm good, Rob. How are you, mate?
Yeah, good, thanks, mate. Good to see there's a bit of enthusiasm in Pakenham for this recording. Very good. Glad to see it. Yeah, I bet it is. And, of course, we've got Damo, who's still up in Sydney. Damo, what's been going on with the Renegades, mate? We've seen super over victories. Mate, talk us through it.
Yeah, there's a bit going on up here with the Renegades. We've had probably all of the highs and lows you could possibly have in a tournament. A couple of players ruled out with long-term injuries, quite a few losses, and then the two wins we have had have been the top side, so just the giant killers, really.
And most importantly, you've knocked off the crosstown rivals in the Melbourne Stars. Like, that would have been the signature win of this competition, surely.
Yeah, no, it doesn't get much better than that when you're beating the crosstown rivals. Probably could have been done in regulation time, but took it to a super over and, put 16 on the board, which is pretty tough to chase.
So is there a bit of banter and a bit of jostling between the Renegades and the Stars camp, particularly maybe even S&C coaches maybe going at it in terms of the sledging?
Nah, Reece and I, not too much between us in terms of the banter about the game. Pretty serious relationship there. But, I don't know. I think we probably have a bit more of a laugh about it at the Renegades in general. But, it was pretty quiet down in the corridor after the game. Not much said between camps. So,
tail between their legs.
Yeah, potentially, Sean.
That's very good. So what's the movement like then, Damo, for the rest of the competition, mate? What's your time frame like? When can we see you back in Victoria?
We've got 4 games left. I think mathematically, if we win each of them and with a good net run rate, we could potentially play finals. But I'd say most likely you'll see me back in Melbourne Monday next week.
Oh, look out. Back in Victoria, the home of the free land of coronavirus, it seems, at the moment. So, look, you wouldn't have thought that. But, yes, firstly, before we get stuck into the next episode of the DeakHeads podcast, we'd like to thank everybody for their support thus far. We say it every week, but it really does mean a lot to us. So thanks for subscribing, liking, commenting on all the various platforms on YouTube and Spotify and the Apple iTunes podcast forums as well. So we really appreciate that. And if you have any questions, queries, concerns, or critique of Sean's performance, then please get in touch with us. We're always happy to help out in any way we can. So let us know. And in fact, as a brief preview of the upcoming podcast, we did have a question that was sent in by one of our loyal band of TRIAX followers in our family. So we'll get to that later. But obviously, if you have any questions, send them in. Really love to answer them for you.
Just before you finish there, Rob, as well, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone that's purchased some merch. We had quite a few orders come in. So much appreciation from us for those that have purchased some merch and put a few dollars in the bank account to keep the business rolling.
Absolutely. Second those sentiments from Damo. A bit surprising that didn't come from Sean, because that is his baby, the merch. I'm not sure where Sean's mind's at the moment.
It's still on the back of the truck. It's on its way. So.
There you go. But no, thanks, as Damo said, thanks for everyone for jumping on board. The gear is coming, so you can get out there and look good in the TRIAX kit. But in touching on our previous podcast, we looked at the return to gyms, particularly Victoria, the easing of restrictions. And so we wanted to continue on that theme because we know pre-season is rolling around pretty rapidly now for a lot of team sports. So we wanted to touch on probably building your tank a bit. So in terms of aerobic training and basically developing our aerobic capacity. So this is an important part of the pre-season puzzle that more athletes need to focus on. So we thought we'd take the opportunity in this podcast to give a practical and hands-on approach to building your aerobic tank or building your engine, as people like to say. And so actually yours truly will be a bit of a test dummy for this podcast. And as you would have seen maybe on the Instagram stories throughout the week, I was out at one of the local running tracks, and I ran myself into the ground for this podcast. So I hope everybody appreciates that effort and sacrifice. But maybe, boys, before we get into just how big my VO2 max is, can we sort of maybe touch on aerobic training methods and building our tank? And, we'll go from there, I think. So one of you boys want to kick us off?
Yeah. So essentially you've got two energy pathways, anaerobic and aerobic. Anaerobic meaning without oxygen, and aerobic is with oxygen. So aerobic training is essentially when you're, for example, running and your muscles require oxygen to burn fuel. So essentially you're going to start out, the body says, shit, we need more energy. Initially, this is going to come from your anaerobic system, and it's going to come really quick, but it's going to deplete pretty quickly as well. And then eventually your aerobic system will kick in, but it does take a little bit of lag time before that starts to kick in. So essentially any activity from sort of 30 to 60 seconds onwards is probably going to be predominantly aerobic in nature, but the exact amount will vary depending on the activity.
Very good. And Damo, so I think you'll have a lot of knowledge in this area, because I've received a lot of Snapchats from you over the journey in terms of you doing some running sessions. So do you maybe want to go into a bit more depth in terms of maybe some training as well around that?
Yeah, I'll put a plug in there first. So there's a nice little blog article on the TRIAX website about building the tank, which yours truly wrote. So if you want to have a read in a bit more detail about that, just check out the website on how to build your tank. But yeah, so as Shawnee was saying, so anything that's sort of that's longer than that 30 to 60 seconds is in that aerobic category that we're looking at training. So there's a few different ways that you might do this. So the most basic that you can start with is just continuous running. So as simple as it sounds, you just run continuously for a set amount of time or a distance, and that is going to help develop your aerobic capacity. Now, obviously, the higher intensity you do this, or the quicker you try to run that distance or time, the more improvements you're going to get. So that's the most basic method that you can use. And then there's different methods that we can use. So if we want to start working at a higher intensity, so training ourselves to run at a quicker pace or for a particular distance, what you would then look at doing is potentially some interval running. So it might be fartlek, which a lot of people would have heard of before, where it's a high intensity bout. So you might say, for example, the simplest thing is if we have a soccer field, you might run the sidelines at a high intensity, and then what you'll do on the goal line portion of the field is run a low intensity, or it might be a light jog. So what you're training yourself to do there is that you're running at that high intensity, so above what your general maximum or continuous running speed would be, and then you're giving yourself a little break, so dropping the intensity right back, which might be a little jog or a walk in that smaller period, to allow yourself to replenish. It's a bit of rest and recovery in that period, and then you'll go again and run at that higher intensity. So essentially what you're trying to do with that training is to train your body to be able to function, and as Sean was talking about, is take in enough oxygen to continue to power your body to run at that speed. So that's probably, if you want to get improvements in your times, you need to start doing stuff like that. So fartlek's probably the most basic. And then what you would look at doing is moving into more interval-based training. So there's many different ways you can do this. So you've got your general HIIT, which is high intensity interval training. So a common one that we'll use and is in a lot of our articles, and that we're going to touch on a little bit more detail later in the podcast, I believe, is MAS, which is maximal aerobic speed. Now, this is based on a 2K time or some sort of testing result that you've got. And so what happens is the intervals that you're running are based on your individual specific aerobic capacity. So again, this is to do with training at or above your capacity. So generally for MAS training, you'd be looking at sort of anywhere between 100 and 130% of your maximal aerobic speed is the prescription that you would use. Obviously, the intensities there are a little bit higher each time. And the aim of that is to, again, train your body to function and run at a higher speed. That's one of the versions there. So maximal aerobic speed through HIIT. And then you've got some variations on that. So you've got short, high intensity interval training, which is shit. Literally, it's shit. But for more details on that one, I think we won't really touch on that too much in this podcast. But again, that's available in the blog post.
No, very good. It's a good overview there, Damo. Some of the stuff that we'll probably talk about in a bit more depth later on. If we want to provide some historical context for aerobic training, like previously when you would discuss aerobic training to a lot of people, it would be that old methodology of running basically long distances and basically running slow. 10 years ago, footy teams would be running around the 10 and doing 3Ks and all that sort of stuff. But we now know that that's probably not the most efficient means of training our aerobic capacity and our tank, particularly with team sport athletes. That it's probably not necessary to run that far given the movement patterns that we undergo in competition. So obviously we're going to have a bit more of an emphasis and focus on the high intensity work, which we'll see some greater benefit out of. But before we get into the nitty gritty of aerobic training and aerobic capacity, we should probably talk about what our end goal is with aerobic training. Like what sort of benefits are we looking to achieve through aerobic training? And then maybe if we can define our aerobic capacity around that and why that would be important then for team sports. So Sean, if you want to kick us off for this one.
Yeah, so I guess as Damo was sort of saying before, any sort of aerobic training, you're looking to improve the amount of oxygen that your muscles can use to produce fuel. And so when you hear the term aerobic capacity or VO2 max, this is the maximum amount of oxygen you can consume. Essentially, all aerobic training, you're trying to get a higher VO2 max. That's going to be important for sports because essentially you'll pretty much just be able to run further and for a longer amount of time, which is obviously important when you're in the dying stages of a match. But as well, you'll be able to recover a bit quicker in between those short and rapid bursts that you'll see within the match, because team sports are obviously mostly stop-start in nature. You're not running just one continuous speed for the whole thing. So yeah, essentially any aerobic training, you're trying to get that VO2 max up, improve the efficiency of your aerobic energy pathways so that you can produce energy and then replenish energy as well.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point what Sean said there about the recovery as well. I think that a lot of people, when they train in this, will train to develop their aerobic capacity, they forget about the importance of the aerobic energy pathways and the aerobic system in facilitating recovery, particularly between your high intensity efforts as well. So that's obviously for team sport and a lot of team sport athletes, that's an important attribute that needs to be considered when you actually undergo your pre-season programming as well. So we've defined aerobic capacity and discussing why that would be important. But Damo, how do we actually determine aerobic capacity? Like, how do people go about that? Now, I know before you actually say anything, I think you've covered this in that blog as well. So we'll probably just give that another quick plug. So I've already done it for you, so you can jump into it if you want.
Yeah, no more plugging of that post. So essentially you need to conduct some sort of test to figure out what your aerobic capacity is. Now, the best and most accurate way to do this would be to conduct the VO2 max test in a laboratory. Obviously, that isn't accessible to the majority of our audience and is quite expensive. So there's other ways to do that. So the most common ones that you would see down at your local footy club or anything like that would be a 2K time trial. So any sort of set distance running tests. So it could be 2K, 1500, 1200, a 1K. You just need a set distance that you're going to cover. And then essentially how you would determine it from that is you collect the time that it takes you to run that set distance. And then there's various formulas out there for the different distances that you can then put that time into. And then that will spit out a number for you which will give you essentially what your VO2 max is from that. So that's one of the most common would just be a set distance run as quick as possible. Then there's other variations. Obviously, most people would have done it before at school. During PE would be the beep test, which
beep.
Is, again, the same system. So you run until you can't go anymore, and then the score that you get then correlates on a table to a specific VO2 max. So again, there's formulas and tables available to figure out what that is. That can then be used to prescribe training with things such as MAS, which we'll again talk about a little bit later. Then there's a few other different ones out there as well. So there's the yo-yo test and the yo-yo. There's a yo-yo 1 and a yo-yo 2. So they're slightly different. These tests have changes of direction. So the beep test obviously is just straight up and down, but there's changes of directions in some, there's rest periods in some. Again, it all depends on what sport you're in. So some are a bit more sport specific than others. So there's a lot of information out there now about what tests you should potentially do. National sporting bodies a lot of the time will also have information out there. So previously the AFL used the beep test, and now they've moved to the yo-yo test, I believe. Rob, is that correct?
Yep, that is correct. Absolutely. Yep.
And then there's a couple others out there as well. So there's the 30, 15 and a couple others. But I mean, the most likely ones that you'll see at your local footy club would be the set distance, so the 2K or the beep test or the yo-yo. They're the most common three that you would see. Yeah,
absolutely. The beep, like everybody knows a beep test, so that's why when you say beep test, I think it probably brings back a lot of horrors for some people. For other people, you sort of remember the good old days when you knocked off a 15.5. Apparently, that's good. I'm not sure, but yeah, I was pretty happy with myself that day. Mind you, I weigh about 55 kilos, so I could just run for days. But so Damo also raises a good point in terms of like set distance tests, the maximal tests around beeps and yo-yo tests. They should be sport specific. So a beep test is essentially like a continuous sort of testing, whereas a yo-yo has more of the stop start with the break period in between. That's important for AFL, footy, and soccer and sports along those lines. So you should try and match the test with your movement patterns in your sport. So that's an important point. So don't go and do a 3K time trial if you're like a rugby league athlete or something along those lines. So make sure it's horses for courses and specific. So now we know the tests, Damo, or Sean actually. Sean hasn't said anything for a while. I'm not sure if he's still there. But when do we test, Sean? When's probably the best time that we can do our testing for aerobic capacity?
Typically, you're probably going to do it on a few separate occasions. You'll probably do it start of the preseason, just before the Christmas break, and just after the Christmas break. I don't think there's any real science behind it. I think for the most part, it's helping to keep players accountable so that they don't drink too many beers or that sort of thing.
Yes.
And they at least get a little bit of running done so they can at least maintain what they sort of had at the end of the season or the end of the preseason. So otherwise, if you're just training individually, you'll probably do it at the start as some sort of an assessment. As Damo was saying, you can so you sort of know where you're sitting, and then you can prescribe your training from there. And then you might retest after every 4 to 8 weeks or so just to see where you're at, and then you can update your training prescription.
Right. If you're an individual athlete, I think that's a great point that you sort of have to be more self-paced with your testing. But if you're a team sport athlete, then obviously you'll do the stereotypical first one at the start of pre-season, then probably one after Christmas or before the season starts itself. So after we've done our testing and we finished our beep, our yo-yo, or our time trial, we obviously get from a beep test, you'll get a result. So you get like your shuttle or your level score, and the same with your yo-yo. And with a time trial, we'll get obviously our time. So what we can do with our results from either the beep, the yo-yo, or the time trial is formulate our aerobic capacity through some equations. But we can also then try and go about improving our aerobic capacity through a particular thing that Damon was talking about before in terms of our maximal aerobic speed. So when we finish the testing in our beep, our yo-yo, and our time trial, we can obtain our maximum aerobic speed, which is a measure that is presented in meters a second. So this is probably a crucial element in the development of our aerobic capacity, which I think the boys would love to talk about. So maybe Damo or Sean, if we can go in a bit more further detail in maximal aerobic speed.
Yeah, so maximal aerobic speed. So this is a measure of the slowest speed, I guess, you can run at where you get maximal oxygen uptake. So simply, as I was saying earlier in the podcast, so what happens is with maximal aerobic speed is once you've got that result, we can actually put your time into a formula. And what that will do is spit out a number for us, which is your maximal aerobic speed. We can then use this to that number to figure out how far you should run in a certain amount of time. And so by giving you that set distance to run in a set amount of time, this is the distance based on your aerobic capacity that you can run in that set amount of time, or that you should be able to achieve. So, for example, if Rob got an 8-minute 2K trial time, we've got a little equation that we've got here, and it figures out that Rob's MAS score is 4.35. So when we get that score, we can then use that to figure out the meters per second that he runs, which is that 4.35 meters per second. So if we were going to get him to run I'll just put in the spreadsheet here. So if we wanted him to run at 100% of his maximal aerobic speed for 20 seconds, Rob would need to run 87 meters. So when we have this data and information, we can then start prescribing training sessions to get Rob to run that set distance. So if we wanted to train him for 100% of his maximal aerobic speed, we'd potentially go, all right, 3 lots of 10, 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off. He needs to cover 87 meters each interval up and down. So this is that interval training that we're talking about. If we then want to start to increase the intensity and get Rob to run faster than 4.35 meters per second, what we can then start doing is increasing the percentage of maximal aerobic speed that we run at. So as I was saying earlier in the podcast, generally you'd be operating anywhere between 100 and 130% of maximal aerobic speed when you're prescribing training. So if I just pull up the spreadsheet here, if Rob was then to run at 110% of his maximal aerobic speed, he'd be covering 96 meters in 20 seconds, and then 120% would be 104 meters, and 130% would be 113 meters. So as you can see, it progressively gets a little bit further that you've got to run each time. And obviously that's going to make Rob a lot more cooked the further that he runs in that time. Yeah. So I guess the important thing with that when we're prescribing this type of training is that at the 100% territory where he's covering 87 meters, we can prescribe higher amounts of volume of training. So, you know, I said 3x10, you could potentially do 4 sets of 10. When we're moving up to the 130%, we certainly wouldn't be asking Rob to run 113 meters in 20 seconds, 4 sets of 10. He'd
find a way.
Gassed. He'd find a way potentially, but he'd be absolutely gassed. So we have mentioned it earlier in previous podcasts about how when you're increasing training volume or intensity, it should be by 10%. So the same rule would apply here. So if we're moving up 10% of his maximal aerobic speed, then potentially we may have to drop back the reps and sets that he completes.
Yeah, it's great. It's great summarization there, Damo. I love the practical examples as well.
I think ultimately, like using your MAS, or it could be VO2 max as well, based on your tests, is ultimately just a prescription tool. So it's ensuring that you're training accurately and to fulfill your needs to get fitter, essentially. So if you're just guessing and saying, oh, I'll run about this far, I'll feel pretty tired then, than not really doing anything precisely. So if you can use these test results, you can work out your training to be more accurately and hopefully yield some better results.
Yeah, that's it. You're able to progress your training more accurately. So when you are starting to get a little bit better, you can actually tailor that so that your improvements are actually accurate. As you said, Sean, if you just go out and one day run 100 meters because you're feeling good, and then the next day you run 82 meters because you're not feeling so good, there's no consistency there in your training. So I guess it does, having these numbers and set distances does make you accountable for what you actually have to do to get that little bit better and fitter.
That's right. That's rock solid, boys. That's really good. I think Sean made a good point there about being a prescription tool, and it's an individualized prescription tool as well. It's not you and your mate doing laps of the oval or whatever. It's specific to you, which is pretty unique, I think, in terms of training. Like if we're talking about the gym, like our previous podcast, we spoke about returning to the gym. Like usually if you're planning a strength and conditioning program or whatnot, that like people tend to use the same program or use a similar program as well. But with MAS, the beauty of it is that it's specific to you individually, and it's going to help you directly, which I think is an important point, and is also probably why the big boys use it in elite sports. So we're looking at a lot of team sports now. The elite level will look to use MAS or MAS-based tools to help improve their athletes' aerobic capacity. So I think it all comes back to moving away from running laps of the 10 and doing all those things that we used to do, because now we know how important maximal aerobic speed is. And we know from research that we'll get a better adaptation in terms of our aerobic capacity, improve that by running at these high-intensity measures at our MAS rather than doing the long, slow 5 to 10Ks on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. So I think that's a pretty important point as to the advantages of using the MAS method. Wouldn't you say, boys?
Yeah, I think for coaches and players at the amateur and sub-elite level, which we're sort of targeting this information to, it's also just a great way to get everyone to train together. Because when you set up an MAS drill, as we said, we can individualize that to every player in the group. So obviously you're not going to set up 35 different markers for different people, but you can set up bands or training groups. So people with set, it might be from 4 to 4.2 MAS scores, they'll run in one group, and then 4.3 to 4.4 will run in another. And so you can break up the training so that it makes it that the intensity or the distances that particular players are running are relevant to their fitness group. But then you can also have multiple groups. So you can have your fittest players making sure that they're working at 110% of their maximum, but also your least fit group are doing exactly the same training, and it's at the same place, same time. You can all do it at the same time. It's just slightly tailored. So it's a really good tool if you're coaching multiple players or a lot of players at one time. You can actually give them the same training stimulus at the same time, rather than having to do 20 different running sessions to set that up for each of them.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're just running like 200s or 400s around the oval as well, then there's going to be blokes that are going to find that pretty easy, and then there's some that are going to struggle a bit more. But as you said, Damo, with the MAS, it's sort of an equal playing field. Yeah,
beautiful. So now we know what MAS is and how we can program it. We should probably talk about the different training methods that are available to us that are based on our maximal aerobic speed. So basically, it's all well and good to have your MAS and your score, but we need to use that and program that effectively to get the result we want. So there's probably 2 or 3 different ways we could go about this in terms of interval-based training, and that's where the most benefit's going to be with terms of intervals. So I might just touch on the 3 different sort of types that we'll look at, and then you boys can go into them in a bit more detail. But firstly, we have long intervals. So essentially, I think we'll define this as probably anything over 60 seconds or 90 seconds, essentially. But long intervals, typically, we're talking about efforts where your intensity probably won't be as high as what it would be in a short interval method, but the benefits surrounding long intervals are essentially accumulating volume in your legs. So one of the progressions when you're talking about maximal aerobic speed training is you don't necessarily want to jump into the high intensity short intervals straight away. There is some sort of progression that you probably should follow. Obviously, if you're a more seasoned athlete, you can probably get away with this. But if you're recreational or you're just playing your local comp, you probably want to do some long intervals first, because what they do is they allow you to accumulate volume and distances in your legs before moving on to high intensity stuff. So in terms of long intervals, if we're talking about percentage of MAS, you're probably looking about 90. That's probably where you're at. Probably just at that stage where you can hold your pace, but if you went for anything longer, then it would probably become unsustainable. So that would probably be the first method you'd look at, and then you probably go into short interval training. So the two short intervals that we'll typically talk about and we'll see is Tabata, which is essentially a Japanese, based on Japanese research from the researcher Tabata, and that looks at basically running shuttles up and back. And then you've got the Eurofit method as well. So that's our more traditional MAS running, where it's sort of like a beep test. You run out in time with the timer, and then you run back in time with the timer. So that's probably an encapsulation or a snapshot of three different training methods there, boys. So maybe if we want to start off with long intervals, anything I've missed there, and then we'll go into the short interval stuff.
Yeah, so the long intervals, I guess from what you're saying there, Rob, it's building the base. That's what we're doing there. So generally the progression for aerobic training is that you might do start with a continuous run, or you might have a continuous run in your program each week, so that you're just getting Ks in the legs. That's your distance. You're just building up that volume. At the start of preseason, for a less seasoned athlete, as we're speaking, you might then progress that into the fartlek style, on-off style running to increase the intensity. And then you'd probably transition into these longer interval sessions and then into your short intervals. So that would be the progression if you're starting from square one. So with the long interval stuff, what you'd be looking at is, as you said, building your capacity. So just working on, okay, this is the speed that I can run for my continuous, and you're just trying to up that a little bit. So, for example, if you run, say, 4 minute 30 kilometers, when you're doing the interval training, you might want to try run, 4 minute 20s or 4 minute 15 kilometer pace for those intervals. So you're just making yourself work that little bit harder. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to run at that pace for 5 kilometers straight, but when you do it in this interval fashion, where you say, for example, run 60 seconds on and then have, you might only have 30 seconds off, depending on what stage of the program you're at, for the work to rest. But what that allows you to do is run at that pace, and then you're giving yourself passive rest. So generally you would actually just physically stop, stand there, and then start again once you've done it. Sometimes you may also do active rest, where it's a very light jog. But we sort of did touch on it earlier, but what you're training your body to do is run at those higher intensities. So run that quicker pace, giving yourself that training stimulus and training your body to actually produce energy, get oxygen in at that intensity, but then giving yourself that rest, which we're talking about, which is super important, just so that you're able to get the oxygen back so that you can keep producing energy during that rest period, and then ramp it up again. So it's going to be on-off periods here. And what you're doing in the rest periods essentially is recuperating and regenerating your energy stores and getting oxygen in so that you can perform at that intensity again.
Absolutely. So Damo, you spoke about rest then. So people want to know specifically how much rest. So usually we talk in terms of rest as a ratio between your work to rest. What sort of work to rest ratio would we be looking at for a long interval?
Yeah, so for long interval, depending on where you're at the training program, so it would be anywhere from a 1-to-1. So that's so if we did 60 seconds work, we would then have 60 seconds rest. So it's the same. Again, if you're then starting to progress that, most of my prescription, I'd never really give more. I would not do a like 1 minute work to 2 minutes rest unless it was like super high intensity. So for this longer interval stuff, you would never really be reaching that point. So you would be looking at having a greater work time to rest time. So you might be anywhere. So a 1-to-1, and you'd probably move up to a 2-to-1. So if we're doing 60 seconds work for 30 seconds rest for these long intervals, you probably wouldn't go any higher than that for this set amount of distance. It just would become quite fatiguing, because if you went to a 1-to-3 ratio, would be 20 seconds rest for 60 seconds work. You might touch that depending on how fit you are, but you would generally start to look at tweaking those work to rest ratios in the shorter interval stuff. When you're doing less volume but higher intensity, you could potentially do that. So you'd be looking at anywhere sort of from 1-to-1 to 1-to-3 at the back end of your long interval training.
Yeah, 1-to-3 would be that'd be a stretch, wouldn't it? Because you still want to maintain a decent enough intensity in this, because it's going to prepare you to move on to intensities that are greater than your MAS later on. So you probably want that 1-to-1's probably your sweet spot. 1-to-2 you could probably get away with, but yeah, if you're a seasoned athlete, you could probably get away with a 1-to-3 in terms of like the intensity. But you want to make sure that we're still hovering around a decent intensity there as well.
That might be week, 3 or 4 of your long interval, depending on how long your preseason is. You might get to that 1-to-3, or you might just go, all right, we'll transition into the shorter interval training.
Yeah, absolutely. So then if we move into short intervals, I think Sean is still on the line there somewhere. I can hear a bit of static impacting them. So, short intervals I introduced before, Sean, we're talking about Tabata and Eurofit. So, Tabata is the one that you sort of go up and back. That's sort of more like Tabata's more like a yo-yo in the way it's run, because essentially you run out and then you turn around and you run back all in one shuttle. Whereas a Eurofit is similar, but except you stop at the end and then you run back. So that's more like a beep test. So maybe if we want to talk about those two forms, Shawnee.
Yeah, so when you start to, I think Tabata by definition is a 2-to-1 work rest. So that's obviously pretty. You're not going to be starting a program with, if you've just jumped off the couch, you're not going to be starting with Tabata, because you'll end up pretty cooked straight away. That's more your high end stuff. As Damo said, once you've done your long intervals, you've progressed into some short interval stuff, and then your Tabata is sort of your big boy stuff where you're really pushing it. With the other short interval stuff, you're probably looking at about a 1-to-1 work rest. And then again, 2-to-1, you probably wouldn't go any further than that, because then it's almost just continuous, because the actual reps themselves are going to be short just purely from their duration. You probably, short interval training, you're probably not going to be running for more than 20 or so seconds at a time, maybe 30 seconds. Simply because the intensity is going to be higher, and if you're trying to run at this ridiculous intensity up here that you're not used to, you're going to flame out pretty quick. So once you've started so that can be sort of your short intervals is essentially your building block for your intensity.
Is there a gauge for different sports on what time frames you would use, Shawnee, in the short interval, like particular sports? So AFL, is there a time range that you wouldn't go over, or soccer or rugby, just based on the demands of the game?
Yeah, so I think when you're trying to do that, that's where your needs analysis sort of comes into play, where you study the movement patterns of the sport, and you work out what are our sort of common efforts that we make. And I think in rugby particularly, they're going to be pretty short, maybe 5 seconds at most, but obviously you still want to train above that for when you are exposed to that. Australian rules footy, that's going to be a little bit longer than that. You're probably going to be going to around 10 and 20 seconds, and soccer's probably the same as well. As I sort of said before, above 20 seconds maybe, but probably not above 30 seconds.
That's good. It's good programming, Sean. It's rock
Thanks,
solid
Rob.
from you, mate.
Thanks.
So we'll probably recap. So if you want to do a progression, you would go like something along like this. You'd probably go long intervals would be the start of your programming. Again, we're probably talking about an intermediate performer here, not someone who's like advanced and has years of training under their belt. So long intervals would be your staple for probably the first, depending on how long your preseason is, you probably go for at least a couple of weeks there. And then you probably move into a Eurofit style. So that would be more of your beep test where you run out. So you're probably working at maybe 15 seconds. So you probably run out for 15 seconds. That's a shuttle. you run back for 15 seconds with 15-second breaks in between there. So it's a 1-to-1. That would probably be a good progression then into like a Tabata. So a Tabata is obviously the way you run out, run back, all in one rep. So again, that's probably your last stage, I'd say, in your progression if you wanted to do it like that. And if you want to you build your tank in that fashion, because like Tabata originally was very, very intense, but they modified it to make it more appropriate for team sports. So if you're talking in terms of like percentage of your MAS, Tabata originally was like 170%. So that's like basically maximal. But obviously with these work to rest periods and how far you run, we can sort of bring that back in a bit. So they're probably the main two there that you want to focus on in terms of short intervals. So you just want to really focus on your work to rest. And then in conjunction with your maximal aerobic speed as your programming tool there, you can map out the distances that are appropriate to you and then adjust accordingly as you develop and get better, I think, boys.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Sounds good. Very good. So we might just wrap up the first part of this component of our aerobic training podcast episodes. And essentially, we've spoken about why aerobic capacity is important. And so, Sean, if you in 10 seconds or less, mate, why is aerobic capacity important?
Helps you keep running throughout a match and helps you to regenerate your energy stores.
Absolutely. And then Damo has a blog on this. Sorry, I'm contractually obligated to tell you that Damo has a blog on this, but how do we test aerobic capacity?
Yep. So just any sort of running test that we've got. So it'd be a time trial over a set distance or one of our beat tests or yo-yo tests where we can get a pace or a set distance that you've covered in a particular time.
Yep. Lovely. Rob, how do we train it? Well, funny you ask that. Yeah, you're probably looking at first you want to grab your maximal aerobic speed, and then we want to program that, and we'd probably look at starting you on some long interval stuff just to build some resilience in the legs, and then move into the short interval stuff. So looking at your Eurofit and Tabata sort of methods there, and then again how we improve it. That's what we use to improve it. Probably looking at 3 days a week initially, moving to 4 days a week, and then using our work to rest ratios around that. So that's probably in a nutshell how we're going to build our tank. But to finish off, as I promised at the start of the episode, we have a viewer question. Boys, this is a first. Unprecedented. This is unprecedented for the TRIAX team. But our viewer question comes from my brother-in-law, Zach. So thanks, Zach, for sending it in. Zach is a recreational footballer, Australian rules footballer. I'll say recreational very loosely. He sort of plays in the twos a bit. Bit of a ruckman. He also plays a bit centre half forward as well, just because you can't move him. But he's trying to get back into his preseason program shortly, and he asked me about the intensity he should train at. Specifically, he said, should he try and accumulate some kilometres in the legs and then move in intensity stuff, or just go with whatever? So can we help out my brother-in-law, boys? Not too much.
It depends a little bit depending on what his starting point is. Like how much training has he been doing the last sort of month or so, or we just pull him off the couch?
Mate, the only gym he's been to, mate, is Jim Beam. So that probably tells you everything you need to know.
So if that's the case, then I think as we sort of spoke about before, we want to do that slow progression where we start to build the Ks in the legs, where we're going at an intensity probably a little bit below our MAS, and the longer intervals, and then from there you can start to move into some shorter interval stuff and build the intensity. Alternatively, I think if you're someone that does train frequently, when it comes to volume and intensity, I think you can always be working on both. You just bias sort of one more than the other. So rather than trying to just do all volume stuff and then all of a sudden, bam, we're trying to do intensity, you can sort of sprinkle a little bit in here and there. So you're working sort of both ends of the spectrum, but you're probably going to work one more than the other.
That sounds good. Damo, have you got any other thoughts you can help Zach? I know he's probably beyond it, but
I would, if you've come from absolutely nothing, a 5K continuous run or something like that is going to be a bit much potentially to start off with. So you strip it back even further. So start with a jog walk. So you can do a similar thing. So those long intervals. So it's legitimately a walk in between. You do some jogging, and you can slowly build up the intensity and then move into that continuous running, and then you can up the intensity with the longer intervals, and then transition into short. And then, I mean, if the preseason is long enough or they're good enough, you might end up at that Tabata, but I'd imagine you'd end up at Eurofit style of short interval training, and that would get you there. I think the most important thing to realize is it doesn't take too long to progress from that, from the jog walk into being able to continuously run. It's just time on feet and getting that volume of training in. So as you said, if you're doing 3 sessions a week, you would see some drastic improvements pretty quickly. So the early doors will be great improvement. It's towards the back end when you're near your maximum, when it's going to be a lot smaller returns.
Yeah, so what Damo said is a really good point there about the baseline of where you're coming from. So I think that's probably something we didn't touch on at the start, was that if you don't have a developed aerobic capacity compared to someone who's more of a seasoned athlete, then your improvements that you'll see will be pretty impressive, to be honest, which is a good thing compared to someone who's closer to their genetic potential, if you want to use that. But again, that's another consideration that we have to incorporate when we're planning your training. But I think that will almost do us for this half of the podcast, boys. Just looking at the time constraints, but the next half of this podcast will be a lot more practical and hands-on. So we've discussed the theory and the background behind some of the methodology and improving your aerobic capacity through the different methods we've talked about. But the next episode you don't want to miss, because yours truly will be the guinea pig. So that was the first part of the aerobic training podcast series we have at the moment. So this one was more of a theory-based. So we talked about the background. And into the second part of this series, we'll look at training me as the guinea pig. So the boys will help map out a program for me, so all the listeners and viewers can see how we program the aerobic capacity training, particularly at TRIAX. So if you do jump on board as a client, you'll probably undergo the same process as I will in the next episode. So be sure to tune into that one, boys. I know you boys will be excited for that one.
Yeah, Rob, it'll be good. We can, unfortunately, I don't think we'll be running the program in person, so we can't crack the whip too much, but.
No, I'm a disciplined athlete, but that'll be good.
As long as you're a full paying customer, Rob, I'll help you out.
Exactly right. That's good, Damo. That's very good, mate. Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. So we really appreciate you watching and listening to the podcast on the various streams we have. So on YouTube, on the Screencast, and then on Spotify and on Apple iTunes podcast. So we thank you all for liking, subscribing, commenting, all that stuff. So again, if you have any questions, feedback, or any queries, then fire them across. We'll be happy to help you out in any way we can. And in doing so, we also offer some pre-season programs as well. So if you need some help trying to get yourself in some good shape before the preseason starts, or if you need some help during the preseason, please reach out to us. We really want to help you get to where you want to be. So the boys and I would love to help you out in any way we can. So from that perspective, get in contact with us. But on that note, if the people out there do want to get in contact with us, how do they do that? Sean, via social media.
If you search for TRIAX Performance on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, you can find us there. I don't think the TikTok, from all accounts, the TikTok's been falling a bit flat. But Rob has mentioned to us that, me and Damo, we actually get bombarded with messages. He'll be like, the last couple of days, Rob's like, boys, check out the reels on Instagram. They're blowing up. There's 500 views on the reels.
Yeah, they are actually.
I've had to actually mute Rob on Messenger because he keeps pestering us about it. But anyway, if you don't actually have TikTok, but you like those sort of videos, you can check out the reels that Rob has been putting together on our Instagram profile. They don't come up in the feed. You got to actually go onto our profile.
Keep it reels.
Yeah, that's good.
And then Damo, so if people want to contact us in the formal old-fashioned way, how do they go about that?
We accept carrier pigeon, but no. So email is admin@triaxperformance.com. And if you want to check out all our fantastic blogs or any of our programs, the website is triaxperformance.com.
Well, that'll just about do us then for this episode of the DeakHeads podcast. And it's probably time to, because we're quickly unraveling here with the TRIAX boys. But we look forward to seeing you next time on the podcast, where I will take the form of a guinea pig. So we'll see you then. Thanks for listening.